Thank you so much, Khomonso. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've now arrived at the anchor of our opening ceremony. Now, our next speaker is a true veteran of South African governance, a figure whose entire career mirrors the very themes of this forum, which is sovereignty, policy, and national development. Now, he has dedicated his life to translating the struggles into tangible state building. Born in Eshowe, KwaZulu-Natal, his formative years were spent actively involved in the youth and student political organizations of the 1980s, which include COSAS and SAICO, where they were mobilizing resistance against apartheid. Now, this foundation of activism was built upon with academic rigor, earning him a Bachelor of Pedagogics and a Master of Arts in Social Policy from the University of Durban, Westville. Now, he was instrumental in establishing the Education Student Society in 1992, and he also served as a branch chairperson of SASCO in 1993, as well as led the Youth Christian Students. Now, his ascent through government saw him tackling the most complex portfolios, including serving as the Deputy Minister of the Home Affairs between the year 2009 and 2010, and later holding full ministerial portfolios for the Department of Public Enterprise between the year 2010 and 2014, and then moved on to the Department of Home Affairs as the Minister between the years 2014 and 2018, and crucially, the Minister of Finance between the year 2017 and 2018. Now, his experience spans the entire spectrum of state capacity, from mobilizing youth on the ground to overseeing the nation's purse and strategic economic assets. Now, tonight, he brings that wealth of experience to challenge and inspire us on how we, as African leaders, can unify our efforts to achieve genuine sovereignty, not just political, but economic and intellectual. Ladies and gentlemen, please may we rise on our feet as you help me welcome on stage the Honorable Dr. Malusi Gigaba for his keynote address.
Siyabonga. You guys are breaking protocol. You are not supposed to ask Inkosi to stand up for an ordinary guy. Dabezitha wena wangasenga siyakhuleka siyathokoza. Sithokoze nakumama. Siyajabula ukuthi sihlanganyele nani. Ngithokoza kakhulu ukuthi ngimbone ngibe phambi kwenu sikothenda bezitha. Today I've had an eventful day. I started by going to the northeast of KZN to address a prize-giving ceremony for children at a school for learners. Now, that's a different audience because you must place yourself at their level and talk to people in grade 1 up to grade 7. Hope that they hear what you are saying. And as we were calling them for their awards, I kept remarking, I wonder if they know what's going on. But anyway, good for them. They made us proud. Over the next few days in Gauteng and those provinces away from the coast, schools closed today in South Africa, and coastal schools will be closing next week. So our children will be getting a long-deserved break from their teachers and from their nagging parents. But because you are young, you don't know this, parents are also getting a well-deserved break from doing homework they don't understand. A lot of this maths and geography, they don't even call it geography these days. A lot of these things that these kids do, we don't understand. So we always have to Google and use artificial intelligence. Thank God for ChatGPT and DeepSeek and so on. We can catch up with a lot of the things that the children are doing. It's like we're going back to school, and sometimes it's really irritating when you have to do an arts project, and that time there is not an inch of you that is artistic. Can't draw, I couldn't draw a fish, and it's such a simple thing. It's one animal with two sides that are equal, you just turn them opposite each other. Couldn't do that, I couldn't draw a pigeon, and now I have to do a complex project. Draw your journey from home to school and highlight all the critical landmarks. How am I going to do that? So it's nice to be on holiday as parents. But also when the program director was introducing me and talking about 1992, you did this, 93, I turned around to check how many of you were there. Back in those days, we were as old as you are, maybe younger. But time has flown very fast. And so we are happy to be here among the youth of our continent. And your conference starts with good weather, relatively speaking, compared to what we've experienced in recent days. South Africa is a bit confused for those who come from outside our shores, because these days we're no longer sure whether we are in summer or still in winter or a hangover of winter. Some days are really cold. And then some days we've got hailstones so big. We don't know what have we done to anger nature. But I think this is a sign of the blessings from the gods for your conference, that the weather toned down, and may it stay like this until your conference is over. But ladies and gentlemen, in his foreword to Walter Rodney's book, Decolonial Marxism, Essays from the Pan-African Revolution, Ngugi, veteran author, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, opines that one of the most frequently propagated colonial mythologies is that Europe and is that of Europe and the West having developed Africa. I'm sure many of you would have heard when you talk to real white supremacists, the regular refrain that without interaction with white people, without the arrival of Europeans in Africa, you people would not be developed. You would not know how to read, you would not know how to write, you would be living in the caves, in the huts, you would still be wearing cow skin. Of course, we all agree, nobody is more arrogant than a colonialist or somebody who still has a hangover of colonialism and white supremacy. And if you read a lot of the writings of these guys back in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries when they began interacting with us, they had such a disdainful view of Africans. On the one hand, you would wonder why then did they come to such a continent of people whom they disdained. But on the other hand, you would understand that in their supremacist minds, they actually didn't think we deserved to live in a continent which can heal you just through its weather, where you really often do not have to do anything else to be cured of your illness but to enjoy the beautiful sun of this continent. So Ngugi writes that the African slave trade and colonization, the conversion of Africans into a commodity, and their dehumanization, both in foreign countries as well as in Africa herself, of course including that of the Indians and other peoples of Asia and the Americas. All of this fueled the heyday of European and Western capitalist development. And thus the cities of Europe and the West were built by riches from slave trade, slavery, and colonialism. Now he flips the narrative. So it's not them who developed us. It's actually us who developed them. And in the course of us developing them, because the process was not mutual, they underdeveloped us. So he says, Western modernity is rooted in the looting of a continent. We know this, that European and Western capitalist development was built on the exploitation of Africa through the slave trade, colonialism, and the extraction of labor and natural resources. As a result, another author on Africa, Guy Martin, says that the emergence of a national capitalism with indigenous, the emergence of a national capitalism within indigenous societies was halted by their encounter with advanced capitalist colonizers. So the natural process of development in Africa, because if we had not encountered the colonial invaders, there was a natural process of development already taking place in Africa. So Africa wasn't this backward place. There was already trade between the kingdoms of the Sudan and up to Egypt. There was not only gold mining in Mapungubwe here in the north of South Africa, between South Africa and Zimbabwe. The people of Mapungubwe were actually adding value on the gold they were mining. And to take and cite a simple example, the mining of iron was already being converted into weapons of war. So they were adding value, and there were people who specialized in that process of the division of labor, who specialized in the making of spears and assegais. It was their job. There was already trade taking place between different regions, and that is why, in the course of that, we encountered one another, learned each other's languages, learned each other's cultures, learned each other's way of life. But the moment we encountered European colonial settlers, they superimposed on our indigenous political, social, and economic systems the social and economic structures of the West. They seized our land, our resources, our labor. They integrated Africa into the global system, but only as a supplier of raw materials, and enforced political and economic integration on their terms for their benefit to maintain control. This colonial legacy, which was later perpetuated by neo-colonial policies like structural adjustment programs, is the root cause of Africa's structural underdevelopment, of conflict, and the marginal role of Africa in the global economy. I want you as young people to have this ingrained in your minds, that when somebody says to you, history does not matter, they say so in order to maintain the existing structures of power, because they do not want you to remember the injustice we suffered and the structural legacy of that injustice, and therefore to commit to changing that. When you look at conflict in the DRC, in Nigeria, when you look at conflict in Mozambique, in Angola, in the Central African Republic, in the South Sudan, the conflict between Sudan, the South and the North, all of those conflicts have their origins in the colonial system and how it partitioned Africa and created artificial states. And how in the course of that, they created an entire trading system which was focused on the exploitation and deprivation of the African continent for the entire and exclusive benefit of Europe and the West. So the entire rationale of trade with Europe since then, of trade, lay in Europe, in that it happened at Africa's expense and was premised on the latter's exploitation. Not only was Africa turned into a wanton hunting ground for slaves, as well as a source of cheap labor and raw materials, she was completely excluded from the centers of production and the developing global value chains. What we suffer today as a continent is as a result of a system that was deliberately and cruelly enforced so that we are unable to get ourselves out of this condition and depend, therefore, at all times to our former colonial masters, even decades after they exited our shores. So, in the context of colonialism, anti-colonialism, in the context of underdevelopment, was created a situation of dependence, as a result of which Africa depends for food on importations from Europe, when in actual fact the vast majority of arable land is in Africa. We depend on Europe, on the United States for resources for our subsistence. And that is why many of our leaders, when they go abroad, and I'm not condoning this, they go there with a cap in hand as beggars. Give us money. And they've become comfortable in accepting this condition of begging. And do very little to change dependency into independence. So we talk of independence in word, but in practice, we do absolutely nothing to pursue it. So Africa entered the International Division of Labor as only a producer of cheap primary commodities with no manufacturing capabilities, skills, or technology. Our job, and you can look at the infrastructure on the continent, particularly road and rail infrastructure, its main purpose was to transport coal, gold, diamond, platinum, and other natural resources, including raw agricultural products, from the centers of production to the ports for exportation to Europe. It was not to create, they didn't serve as network industries as they ordinarily should be. Their job was to move primary products from pits to ports. And this has remained Africa's role in the International Division of Labor and our role in the global value chains. We give everyone that which they need to do in order to give us, at a very high cost, that which we need to survive, to grow our economies, to develop. It was important, therefore, for colonialism to ensure that it precluded trade within Africa, between one colony and the other. When colonialism started, all of this trade between the different empires, African kingdoms and empires, came to a halt. It stopped. So no colony could trade with another. No colony did trade with another. We all had to view each other with envy as competitors. Competitors in trading with the motherland. So the duty of each and every of the 54 African states was to outcompete the others, to trade with the motherland, because we could not trade with one another. We were not allowed to. This further tilted the terms of trade, as well as the prices of commodities in favor of the motherland. So they could decide. If Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of the African continent, but South Africa also had good weather for the production of food, we had to fight with one another to compete, to ensure that we sell our products, similar products, to Europe. And in the course of that, because we were fighting, Europe could offer us any which price it wanted. Because for them to buy my products, I needed to sell to them at a cheaper price. Because if I increase my price, then they buy yours. So we took whatever price they offered, and trade happened only on their terms. Given this situation, that colonies were not permitted to trade with one another, and could hence for a long period not establish institutions and an infrastructure of political and economic integration. This has over the years led to economic disintegration, structural underdevelopment, and failure to achieve political unity and person-to-person relations on a continent-wide basis. We still view each other with suspicion. We still, we can sit in many platforms and talk Pan-Africanism until comes a time when we must put it to practice. And we start demonstrating just how much we don't like one another. We still view each other as competition. We still are prepared to open up our economies and countries to European tourists, but view Africans in our countries as illegal immigrants. We have not outgrown that colonial condition which sought to ensure, and it's an old truth for those who are older. You will remember that in South Africa we had an organization called the United Democratic Front, and one of its slogans was UDF unites, apartheid divides. It was the very foundation of the ANC, was to put an end to amaXhosa, namaZulu, nabaTswana, nabeSuthu, namandebele, namaswati, who viewed each other with suspicion and were fighting with one another. The ANC said, no, all of you, you are one people. Whatever language you speak, whatever culture you practice, whatever your customs may be, you are one people. You are all oppressed in common. And your common duty is to overthrow these other ones who are oppressing you. That is why even when Indians arrived, we didn't take a hostile view of them. Our view was that they've been brought here as indentured labor, they are slaves. And our duty is to unite and work with them to overcome the reasons for their enslavement. So, the colonial system deliberately fostered disunity. And the legacy of that still lives on. In that, if you look at intra-African trade, it is the lowest compared to intra-Asian trade or intra-European trade. We can't trade with one another. We still can't. And we still do not take drastic and decisive measures to ensure that we create conditions that will enable intra-African trade to grow decisively. Much of the conflict in many regions of the continent owes to this background, which was deliberately inculcated by colonial structures in order to entrench its rule beyond the period of its formal existence. Look at the DRC. The fight there in the east of the DRC. It has nothing to do with the Congolese people. And we could have overcome that conflict if Western powers, both in the US and in Europe, were not so active in perpetuating that conflict and causing all those countries of the Great Lakes region, including in the East Africa and Southern Africa, to be unable to intervene. In actual fact, the biggest issue there is the fact that Congo does not have a government able to run the whole country. We must overcome that. This history and background has been significantly responsible for the structural challenges our continent faces in the 21st century. And I keep referring to structural challenges because I'm trying to underline the fact that these are not minor challenges that can be fixed through reforms. They need decisive intervention. So we cannot overlook the impact of neocolonialism and imperialism and how they connived to further perpetuate Africa's underdevelopment and marginalization. It's always been understood that the state is a key driver of economic progress, responsible for directing growth and establishing the institutional framework to sustain it. This perspective underwent a dramatic reversal in the 1980s, as many African countries were told to reduce state involvement, liberalize their economies, privatize their state-owned enterprises and public programs. But the promise of massive investment and donor funding from privatization did not materialize. But instead, we saw a continued drop in both donor aid and private investment, which led to the weakening of state capacity and erosion of essential public capital. So today Africa sits with a massive infrastructure backlog, which a decade ago was estimated at $38 billion annually. So it meant we needed on a yearly basis to invest $38 billion in infrastructure expansion in order to catch up with the backlog that we were facing. Yet a vital role for the post-independent state is not as an overseer of the status quo. It's a driver of development and broader social change. The formation of the African Union was meant to change this condition. And the AU, since its formation, has pioneered a number of interventions, NEPAD, the African Peer Review Mechanism, Agenda 2063, and others in order to regenerate the continent. But we must admit that many of these programs, notwithstanding, remain pertinent. Conflict, lack of infrastructure and structural transformation, as well as bad governance and absence of sustainable development in many countries. The discussions, therefore, in which you are going to engage in this forum are about asserting Africa's agents and affirming the notion that the future is not an accident. Because if we must have the future we want, it means we must become the agents for the establishment of that future. If we must reclaim the continent's future, we must become the agents for that future which we want. At this moment, Africa has the advantage of a youthful population with unmatched potential. Yet that youthful population is trapped in structural unemployment. We have abundant resources, yet those resources benefit others more than us. We have sovereignty in anthem, but we have dependency in practice. So, let's be clear. Africa cannot negotiate her future from the margins. We must move from being a continent defined by external forces to a continent shaping global narratives. In terms of the vision for the future, we must move away from being a victim of history to becoming the architects of our own future. There is a history which nobody can deny, but that history must not hold us captive. We can't sit here despairingly saying, oh, we were colonized, oh, this happened, and therefore we are victims. We are powerless against this inordinate power of history. If history was that powerful, we wouldn't be independent 54 African states, with the exception of Western Sahara. The fact that we are independent speaks to the agency of our people, our ability to rise up against whatever condition that seeks to suppress us in order for us to assert our independence. We have done it politically, we can do it economically. This is what this requires. First, we must reclaim strategic sovereignty over economies, resources, data, and innovation. African leadership must eschew the old practice of approaching the world with a victim mentality, always begging for donor grants and aid. For long, we've been pitiful beggars, shameful beggars, happy to become victims of a scramble among the world's major powers. The changes in the geopolitical environment, with the increasing US aggression, imposing tariffs on many countries, presents a potential for Africa to reposition herself in terms of her negotiations with other powers that promise to help us out of this situation. So instead of positioning ourselves as yet another beautiful bride for a new scramble, African countries must ramp up their manufacturing capabilities, develop better and more dynamic management of their natural resources, and increase their bargaining power and position themselves differently. You see, you can't ask Botswana to sell coal to South Africa because South Africa also has its own coal. But once we extract these natural resources and add value, beneficiate them, then we will create, out of our different comparative advantages, products, goods, commodities, materials with which to trade with one another. But we can't sell to each other primary commodities. We've got to invest in developing manufacturing capabilities to better manage our natural resources, including agricultural and food products, so that we have something with which to engage in intra-African trade. Secondly, we must revitalize Pan-Africanism as a practical strategy for unity and economic integration, exemplified by the African Continental Free Trade Area. What this requires is that we need a political will to cooperate with one another, to unite and to trade with one another. So long as we think that I need to be first in Europe, so long as for me to fly to many capitals of the African continent, I must first fly to Europe or to Dubai. It speaks to the absence of agency, to the absence of political will. If we must revitalize Pan-Africanism, we must ensure that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area assists us gradually to ramp up intra-African trade to the same levels as in Europe and Asia. We must resist bilateral agreements with various global powers that seek to undercut our continental unity. Resist bilateral agreements with global powers that seek to undercut our continental unity and that seek to undermine the development of manufacturing capabilities. This means we must resist being turned into a subordinate partner of any country or region. Pan-Africanism must foster a Pan-Africanist consciousness, a Pan-Africanist sense of pride and assertiveness, rather than cowardice and a beggar attitude. Thirdly, we must embrace a new leadership model, leadership for liberation, underpinned by ethical and accountable leadership, focused on building capable developmental states. So the continent needs a different type of leader. Not as an individual, but as a collective. I mean, at the heart of everything we are talking about is this new cadre of leadership straddling across the continent of the types of Amilcar Cabral, Thomas Sankara, Oliver Tambo, of Robert Mugabe, of Joshua Nkomo, that type of leadership of Julius Nyerere, Sam Nujoma, that type of leadership. Agustino Neto, Samora Machel, Eduardo Mondlane, that type of leadership, whom no one could tell that Africa doesn't deserve independence. In actual fact, they were prepared to lay down their own lives, and many of them actually did, so that we attain independence. Fortunately, your generation doesn't have to die for freedom. You have to live for freedom. Yes. Don't die for it. You now have been given the possibility, instead of dying for freedom, to actually live for it. And this is what we want you to do. To be this different type of leader that develops a vision, a sustainable vision for the continent. Take two examples. About 5 decades ago, you had a barren desert in the Gulf states. Today, everybody goes to Dubai. Actually, when you get to Dubai, you forget you are in a desert. Because what they've done with that country, they've turned it into a global tourist and gold manufacturing site. Take Shanghai in China. It wasn't there 40 years ago. There was no Shanghai 40 years ago. But a sustainable vision and a leadership committed to that long-term vision, to modernization, to growth and people-centered development, developing developmentalist agents, and deploying the vast resources of their countries for the common development of their peoples and countries is what they had. It is what we need. It's what we need. A leadership that thinks differently. There was a time when we had a leadership committed to freedom. They fought selflessly for freedom. Then we had a leadership committed to self-service that used all of these resources for themselves. Now we need a leadership committed to take the best of the first generation of liberators and take the best of the leadership of other countries in the world and say, what can we do in Africa in order to catch up and to develop our continent? Fourth, we need to empower youth as core agents, empowered and committed to harnessing their innovation to build sovereign industries and move from exporting raw materials to finished goods. It's said that 1 in 3 young people on earth by 2035 will be African. 1 in 3. So you can imagine the potency of that statistic alone. And that the working age population in Africa will exceed China and India combined. The working population will exceed China and India combined. Depending, therefore, on how African leaders view this and what they do with it, This will present either an enormous potential to catapult our continent into a new era of development and independence, or it will constitute a major risk. You can imagine youth with all this energy and power, the dynamism and versatility they have, if they are not employed productively. They do say idle minds create evil consequences. So this latent potential of the young population in Africa can be turned into a force for destabilization if we don't use it productively and constructively. Investing in both human capital development and structural transformation will create a different outcome for the continent. Fifth, we must build prosperity by design through creating internal value chains and retaining wealth within Africa. Above all else, this means we need to exercise control over finances. It means we must mobilize and harness domestic resources, finance and capital, and use them to develop the continent. Instead of relying on foreign investments, we must mobilize these domestic resources that reside in our insurance and pension funds and deploy them towards infrastructure development and developing capabilities. So, if debt in Africa was denominated on the basis of our domestic currencies, if the majority of debt in Africa was owed to insurance and pension funds, if debt in Africa was mostly owed to domestic finance institutions, we would stand a greater chance of stabilizing our macroeconomic policies, of having a fiscal outlook that was more stable, less susceptible to global shocks, and less susceptible to manipulation by ratings agencies and foreign investors. This is what the developmental states of East Asia did. It's how they drove industrial transformation, by ensuring that they aligned private initiative with state priorities and controlling finance, which ensured business compliance with industrial policy. So we are therefore called upon to exercise decisive leadership, not as a position, but as a generational responsibility. This forum provides a platform for regeneration. My wish is to see it grow and having more youth organizations, civic, civil, students, and others, including political youth organizations, on condition they are not here to bicker. That this is not a platform to test your ideologies, but it's a platform to grow and develop the continent together, to nurture a generation of leaders from across the continent that are going in every corner to share a common vision of how to build and take this continent forward. So as we establish the Johannesburg Doctrine, a doctrine rooted in unity, in sovereignty, in innovation, integrity, and intergenerational leadership, we must be of the same mind that the Pan-African Leadership Forum must become the brain's trust the intellectual home of Africa's new leadership, the repository of the best young African brains. It must be the crucible of our continental doctrine, the engine room of innovation and collaboration, and the meeting point of African identity and ambition. So this is not a policy meeting, it's a continental covenant. Underpinned by this understanding that if Africa is not united, the world will decide our future for us. If Africa stands united, the world will respect us. If Africa stands determined, the world will make way for us. I hope you are a generation that will be more confident to the point of arrogance. I always make an example, for those of you who have ever read the late President Mandela's speech at the treason trial. That very last part of his speech, when he says, "This is an ideal for which I am prepared to live, but my Lord," and it is in how he said it, "but my Lord, if needs be, it's an ideal for which." Then he started counting his words because he was registering a point. No moment was ever more courageous than that one. No moment was ever more arrogant than that moment when here these men with wives and children stood up, shoulders high, heads high, chest out, and told a monster that you can do your worst. We are not scared of you. We will achieve the goals which we have set for ourselves. I wish your generation could be that. I wish that you would stand up, heads high, shoulders high, chest out, and claim your future.